Hello again, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about perfect tenses in English. So let's look at a couple quotes first. First, he who has begun has half done, a quote from Homer. And second, he who has never hoped can never despair, a quote from G.B. Shaw. So what tense do both of these quotes use? That's right, they're both in the present perfect tense. Now, to form the present perfect tense, we use the word has or have combined with the past participle of the main verb. So now let's turn to some present perfect forms in affirmative, interrogative, and negative sentences, looking at the first table. To make an affirmative sentence, I, you, we, or they have already read a newspaper. Here we use I, you, we, and they with have. However, he, she, and it will require the word has. He, she, or it has already read a newspaper. In the negative sentence, we say I, you, we, and they have not read or haven't read a newspaper yet, or he, she, or it has not read or hasn't read a newspaper yet. And finally, in the interrogative sentence, has and have moved to the beginning. For example, have I already read a newspaper? And it will be the same for you, we, and they. Or, has she already read a newspaper? Here, has moves to the front. And to answer these simply, you can just say, yes, she has, yes, I have, or no, I haven't, and no, she hasn't. The following adverbs are signal words of the present perfect tense. Already, just, ever, never, yet, recently, this morning, since, and for example, for a week, a month, a year, and so on. So now let's examine some more cases of usage of the present perfect tense. In the first example, I have known him for a year. Here, I met this person a year ago, and we still know each other. We still keep in touch. Maybe we call each other once a week. Or, I have also taken up tap dancing recently. Here, I started tap dancing a little while ago, and I still do it. I have taken it up recently. And in both of these cases, I'm talking about actions which started in the past, but still have an effect in the present. Some more examples I could say the present perfect tense with are, I have already translated the article. Here, I started translating it in the past, and it is finished. Or another one, children have already cleaned the room. In this example, the children were supposed to clean the room in the past, and they have already done it now. So in these examples, we are using the present perfect tense to explain about the result of past actions. And the result has an effect in the present. And finally, I can say something like, have you ever been skiing? Or have you ever been to Paris? In these examples, I am talking about previous experiences up to now, and these happen in an indefinite time in the past. So to express past actions which happen at an indefinite time in the past, we can use adverbs such as ever, never, yet, and before with a perfect structure. Now, there are two more prepositions that I want us to examine, since and for. And let's look at some examples using both since and for. I can say that John has lived in Berlin for 2 years. 2 years ago, John moved to Berlin, and he has lived there since then for 2 years. But if I say that John has lived in Berlin since 2013, I know that John moved there in 2013, and from that time, or since that time, he has lived in Berlin, and he still lives in Berlin. Or I could also say something like, they have gone hiking for 2 weeks. Here, I know that 2 weeks ago, they went hiking, and they're still hiking. Or I can say that they have gone on a hiking tour since Monday. On Monday, they left for the hiking tour, and they're still on it. So, the basic difference between these two words is that since tells you the starting point. Since this point, they have been doing something. However, for tells you about the duration, about the period of time. They have been doing something for 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, 2 seconds. It can be anything, just a duration. So that's all I wanted to tell you about the present perfect tense. But now I want to bring your attention to the present perfect continuous tense and some of the ways that we use it, as well as compare it to the present perfect tense. So now let's turn to the present perfect continuous forms in affirmative, interrogative, and negative sentences. To form an affirmative sentence, you can say something like I, you, we, or they have been reading a newspaper the whole morning. And just like in present perfect, he, she, and it, you say has. So, he has been reading a newspaper. In negative sentences, you say I, you, we, and they have not been reading or haven't been reading a newspaper the whole morning. And similarly, he, she, and it has not been reading or hasn't been reading a newspaper the whole morning. So the following adverbs then are signal words that the present perfect continuous tense is being used. If I say something like for an hour, for a week, for a long time, or all morning, all day, or the adverb since, you know that the present perfect continuous tense is being or should be used. So now let's look at some cases where we use the present perfect continuous tense. In the first example, I have been dancing for 3 months already. 3 months ago, I started taking dancing lessons, and I've started to get pretty good because I still do them. In the second example, you have been talking on your phone for an hour. It means that an hour ago, you started talking on the phone and you are still doing it. So here we're using the present perfect continuous tense to emphasize the duration of an event. You have been talking for an hour. We can also use the present perfect continuous tense to express an action which started in the past, but the results are still visible in the present. For example, I am exhausted. I have been working all day. Here, I am exhausted is the result of what I have been doing, present perfect continuous, all day. Or, in a second example, the child's shoes are wet because she has been playing in the rain. Here, she has been playing in the rain, and the result is her shoes are now wet. So now, I'd like us to compare the differences between the present perfect continuous and the present perfect tenses, and comment on some of the differences between them by looking at Table 3. For example, in present perfect, you have talked on the phone with your friend for an hour. Or in the present perfect continuous tense, you have been talking on the phone for an hour already. The second example, John has read an interesting book recently. And in the second, John has already been reading the book he borrowed from the library for 3 weeks. And a third example, I have already saved enough money to buy new hiking equipment, and I have been saving for new hiking equipment for 2 months, but I still cannot afford it. In these first examples, in the present perfect tense, the action is already finished, and there is a result of this action in the present. But in the present perfect continuous tense, the action may or may not be finished. It started in the past and continues up to the moment of speaking, and we are mainly interested in the duration of this action. So, a few more examples. The first, in present perfect, to lose weight, we have started to attend dance classes recently. Or, in the continuous now, we have been attending dancing classes for a week already. In the first, we have an action which began and continues to the present. But in the second, we have an action which began before the moment of speaking, and we want to stress that it still applies now. Next, if I say, his family has lived in Kiev for 10 years, it sounds like his family has always lived in Kiev. But if I say his family has been living in Kiev for 2 years, it tells the listener that his family has moved to Kiev 2 years ago and still lives here. Or, Nick's father has worked at this plant for 15 years. Compared with, Nick's father has been working as a travel guide for only 2 weeks. In both variants of this sentence, present perfect and present perfect continuous, they have almost the same meaning. The only difference is that if you want to stress the duration of this action, you should use the present perfect continuous instead. Present perfect continuous sounds like the action lasted a shorter period of time, and you are more interested in duration. In present perfect, the action seems to be permanent or lasted longer. And finally, they have been repairing the house for a month, and the house has been repaired. You should note here that the present perfect continuous tense does not have a passive voice. So our next step in studying perfect tenses is going to be the past perfect tense and the past perfect continuous tenses. So let's examine how to form these structures by looking at Table 4. To form the past perfect tense in an affirmative sentence, it's even easier than forming it in the present tense. Because no matter if you're using I, you, we, they, he, she, or it, you will always say had. For example, I had already come home, or she had already come home. Here, it's all the same. Likewise, in a negative sentence, it works the same way using had not. And just like in present perfect, in the interrogative sentence, we move had to the front of the sentence. Had I come home? Had she come home? Had they come home? And finally, to answer questions asked to you in the past perfect tense, it's even easier. For a positive answer, you can always say, yes, I had, or yes, she had, yes, they had. It doesn't change. Likewise, for a negative answer, no, I had not, or I hadn't. No, she had not, or she hadn't. And no, they had not, or they hadn't. Now, let's look at some cases of usage of the past perfect tense. In the first example, when he returned home, his family had already eaten supper. Or, in the second example, Anne began studying English, which she had wanted to do for years. And finally, his uncle mentioned that he had not played billiards before. Here, past perfect continuous, or past perfect, tells us that the action happened before the given moment in the past, or was completed before this given moment in the past. So, basically, it's just like present perfect, but in the past. The past perfect continuous tense, formed by using had be and the present participle, remember the ing form, is used a little bit differently, but is very similar to the present perfect continuous tense. So let's examine some ways of forming it in Table 5. To form the past perfect continuous tense in affirmative sentences, it's much the same as in the past perfect. You can always say I, you, we, they, he, she, or it had, but just like in present perfect continuous, you need to add been. I had been coming home. They had been coming home. We had been coming home. In a negative sentence, had will change to had not. For example, I had not been coming home. They had not been coming home. We had not been coming home. In interrogative sentences, had again moves to the front, but the rest stays put. For example, had I been coming home? Or had we been coming home? Or even, had it been coming home? And finally, to answer these questions in positive and negative forms, you will answer them the same way as in past perfect. Yes, I had. Yes, we had for a positive answer. Or no, they had not, or they hadn't. And no, he had not, or he hadn't for a negative answer. So now let's look at some cases of usage of the past perfect continuous tense. For example, Jane had been preparing for the exam for 3 months before she passed it. Here, the sentence is telling me about what she had been doing up until this point, until the point where she passed the exam. Or, another example, the tourists had been traveling for 3 hours when the bus broke down. And finally, one last example, we had been talking for over an hour when he called us. Here, the past perfect continuous, much like the present perfect continuous, tells me about what had been happening up until this point. The only difference is when. So let's recap the material that we've learned today. We've discussed perfect tenses in the present and the past, specifically the present perfect continuous, past perfect, and past perfect continuous tenses. And I highly suggest that you review this lesson once and maybe even twice or thrice more, because this material is very, very important. So, that being said, I'll see you all in the next lesson. Bye!